We're now going to move on to debating motion 50. As you will imagine, there are quite a lot of speakers wishing to speak on this topic, so we have allowed additional time within this section to facilitate as broad a discussion as possible. Can I remind you to declare any conflicts of interest if you're speaking to this motion? And I would also advise you that if parts 2, 3, 4 or 5 pass, motion 51 will automatically fall. So, to move to the motion, can I call on Dr. Coral Jones from City and Hackney Division to propose the motion on behalf of the Agenda Committee?
Good morning, Chair and RB. I'd like to thank the Medical Ethics Committee for the evidence-based discussion paper on decriminalisation which was circulated prior to this ARM, and thank you, Chair, for arranging this excellent discussion this morning. I'm an inner-city GP, and as a declaration of interest, I'm a member of Doctors for a Woman's Choice on Abortion. Decriminalisation is the removal of abortion from the penal code. Doctors and women will no longer face the threat of imprisonment for procuring or performing abortions. There is no evidence from international studies that decriminalisation leads to an increase in third trimester abortions, which is a frequently voiced concern. Following decriminalisation, abortion providers will be regulated by the GMC standards of good medical practice, including consent and confidentiality, which have been brought up this morning. Central collection of anonymised abortion data will continue, and health professionals will have a statutory right to conscientious objection. Malicious attempts to procure abortion or illegal supply of abortifacients will be subject to existing criminal law. So why push for decriminalisation when we have the 1967 Act? In the UK, women have been in prison for up to 7 years, and doctors had restrictions placed on their practice due to the penal codes in the 1861 Act. Fear of prosecution can prevent doctors from making decisions where the health of their patients is their first consideration. An appalling case of the implementation of the 1861 Act occurred in Ireland in 2012 with the death of Savita Halappanavar, who died due to complications of a septic miscarriage. Would doctors have stood by and watched to die if they had not been worried about prosecution? My experience is that women do not request abortion lightly, and 80% of abortions in 2016 occurred under 10 weeks. During 25 years of general practice, I have never had a woman request a late abortion in the absence of severe fetal anomaly. Decriminalisation requires regulation and clarity about what is and what is not lawfully permitted. In the coming academic year, Professor Leslie Regan, President of the RCOG, will supervise a study of abortion regulation and make recommendations to be put out to consultation. It is important for doctors to understand that if abortion is decriminalised, it will still be regulated, and what these regulations might look like. People have expressed concerns that Motion 50 will result in abortion on demand carried out in any location by non-medical practitioners up to term, and that the right to conscientious objection will be removed. Decriminalisation with regulation will not lead to these outcomes, and conversely, the 1861 law does not protect against them. The current law is also silent on sex-selective abortion. The best way to deal with the issue of unplanned pregnancies is to prevent them, and I urge everyone here who is concerned about abortion to campaign vociferously against the worsening cuts to sexual health and family planning services. In conclusion, I urge you to support parts 1, 2, 3 and 6 of this motion. Parts 4 and 5 were not in our original motion but raise important issues. I request that these two parts be passed as a reference and put out to consultation once Professor Regan has made her report. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Coral. Can I now call Ms Sarah Johnson from Cardiff and Vale of Glamorgan Division, who is speaking against the motion.
Chair and RB, I speak against this motion as a woman, as a soon-to-be doctor, and I speak against it for women. Although it's a very extensive motion, it doesn't provide me with any real evidence that a change in the law will be beneficial for women. Even more worryingly, this motion doesn't address at all the key area of coercion of women. Abortion isn't usually an easy decision, but if policy were to change as described, women in abusive relationships would no longer be protected. The current system has mechanisms which aim to safeguard women against being pressurised into an abortion that they do not want. Are we saying that we want women's voices to be silenced? Furthermore, women will be at an increased risk if they procure abortions at home. I've never had a child, but I couldn't imagine going through a process like that at home without a medical professional even being aware that it was happening. If a woman has felt so unable to seek medical advice prior to an abortion, do we think she's going to seek help if something goes wrong? Are we not just telling women to keep it hidden and behind closed doors? Repealing the current abortion law would allow abortion to be done anywhere. This motion states it will be regulated like other medical procedures, but which ones? Hip replacements or lip fillers? After our discussion this morning, we know that there's an appetite to improve the care of women undergoing abortion. We should be concentrating on safeguarding and supporting women physically and emotionally, rather than opening up the system to coercion and abuse. At the very most, this entire motion should be taken as a reference. RB, I urge you to reject this motion.
Thank you. May I now call Dr. Megan Brown from the Junior Doctors Conference, who is speaking for the motion and is a first-time speaker.
A third of women in the UK will receive an abortion in their lifetimes, making it one of the most common gynecological procedures. Yet we insist on regulating this with a legal framework rooted in the conservative values of the Victorian era. Granted, the Abortion Act is only 50, but this did not and does not go far enough to liberate women from patriarchal and traditionalist law. The Abortion Act hands over the power of decision-making over your reproductive rights to two doctors from the woman. In 1960s Britain, this was the norm for many medical decisions that we now see as self-evidently belonging to the patient. I could make a decision to receive cosmetic surgery, to refuse a blood transfusion, but I do not have the right to decide whether it is in my best interest to have an abortion. Are we not taught to respect patient autonomy? Some have even argued this goes far enough to breach the European Convention on Human Rights, as it's denying women this essential autonomy. This and the stigmatising effect of criminal sanctions applying to abortion show us abortion law needs reform. Abortion should be completely decriminalised until the age of viability and subject to the same professional standards that regulate any other medical procedure or prescription. Decriminalisation is less likely to push more women into procuring their own means of unregulated abortion and more likely to break stigma so women feel comfortable approaching us as doctors to safely support them in a time of need. Over the coming year, it is both the 50th anniversary of the Abortion Act and the 100th anniversary of women securing the right to vote in the UK. Would it not be fitting to call upon MPs, who women now have a say in electing, to decriminalise a fundamental women's right to control her own fertility and hand over a very personal decision back to women? Thank you.
Thank you. Can I now call Dr. Amy Watson from the Junior Doctors Conference, who's speaking against the motion and is also a first-time speaker.
Chair, RB, I'm a junior doctor concerned about many parts of this motion. Little 2 and 3 support a campaign that claims we trust women, but are we even listening to what women want? Last month's ComRes poll found that 70% of women want to see the abortion time limit reduced to 20 weeks or below. Let's not trivialise abortion into a postal DIY service, removing the need for discussion and assessment. The rise in online abortion pills is a concerning challenge. But do we remove laws because people are breaking them? The risk of prosecution is an important deterrent. Admittedly, online pills can be a desirable option for women who wish to try and solve the problem of their unwanted pregnancy in secret. But should we encourage women to deal with this on their own? No, that's not safe, that's not compassionate, it's isolating. A woman may not feel that she can't talk to her friends or family, but she should feel welcome to talk to her doctor. Diana Johnson's recent Commons Bill called for the removal of the important safeguard of two-doctor consent. No, let's show women that they matter enough that despite the current ethos of medical austerity, they warrant the attention of two medical minds. Women need time to think. After all, you wouldn't have a surgical procedure without any face-to-face pre-op, would you? And on to little 5. The number of prosecutions is already very small. These cases are extreme, well into the 3rd trimester. How is aborting a healthy, viable baby not criminal? RB, I have no doubt that this motion is well intended, but it's deeply flawed in all its parts. The BMA, the voice of doctors, influences parliamentary debate. What message do we want to give MPs? That we care so little about women and their unborn babies that we are happy to pass such an ill-thought piece of policy. And so, RB, whichever side of the abortion fence you sit on, please reject this motion.
Thank you. I now call Professor Wendy Savage from Council, who's speaking for the motion. Wendy? Yes. You're here, sorry.
Good morning, RB and Chair. Last year, when I proposed that we should look at this issue, I was pleased to refer it to the Medical Ethics Committee, and I would like to congratulate them, the Secretariat, on preparing such a very balanced document, which I hope everybody has read. The discussion we had this morning, I think, shows that a lot of doctors have understood that it is the woman who makes the decision to have an abortion, whether the law is available for her to do that or not. And 59 years ago, as a medical student, I saw the first woman die from abortion. She was 35, married, had 3 children, and objectively one could say, well, why did she need to have an abortion? She felt strongly that she could not carry on with an abortion, with a pregnancy in her circumstances, and she took the law into her own hands. This is something that women will continue to do, whatever the law says. I think that the response of the Christian Medical Fellowship to this paper to say that women are going to abort up to term is completely over the top. In my experience, based on 30 years of providing abortions and 10,000 abortions approximately that I've performed, women do not present after 24 weeks to have an abortion unless they're mentally handicapped, have learning disabilities, or are extremely young and their parents haven't noticed that they were becoming pregnant, that they showed signs of pregnancy. Women themselves do not feel that they want to continue with a pregnancy unless, to end a pregnancy after about 24 weeks. And last year there were only 226 abortions after 24 weeks, and those were on the grounds of fetal abnormality. The way that women are treated is really important, and it has changed. In 1967, it was a paternalistic law that was passed. And because of the clause that says if the risk of the pregnancy is greater than if the pregnancy continuing was greater than if the pregnancy was terminated, one can actually operate abortion on request. That makes me realise that I forgot to say that I've been the coordinator of Doctors for a Woman's Choice on Abortion since many of you before many of you were even born, 1977. I would urge you all to support this motion and send a message to the women of Britain that we trust women and we know that you're capable of making up your own minds about your own lives and your own bodies. I also would suggest that parts 4 and 5 are used as centres of reference because I think the important study from the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists will give us information about that area. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Can I now call Dr. Rachel Pickering from Yorkshire Regional Council, who's speaking against the motion.
Chair, RB, good morning. I speak as a feminist who is deeply committed to both furthering the rights of women and protecting vulnerable women. We do not need to decriminalise abortion. To do so would put more vulnerable women at risk of abuse. Let's look at a couple of the very few countries who have decriminalised it. China, not exactly a bastion of human rights and freedoms, is it? And interestingly, Canada, where data collection is very unreliable, and the Canadian equivalent of our own BMJ described their country as being a haven for parents who would terminate female fetuses in favour of having sons, to the extent that some Canadian communities now have an 8 to 10% disparity between boys and girls. This feminist is angry to hear of women undergoing sex-selective abortions, no doubt pressured by men in most cases, and often within patriarchal cultures where there is no legislative framework to protect women from abuse. Our own law may not be perfect, but at least there are criteria that need to be satisfied. Make no mistake, RB, this motion is part of an organised campaign to drastically change UK law. A private member's bill is very likely to materialise in the next parliamentary session, and BMA policy carries great weight in Parliament, on these issues at least. This motion is not coming from a groundswell of opinion amongst BMA members. No, it's coming from a very small minority of extreme campaigners. Please, RB, don't make the BMA the unwitting stooge of these extremists. Whether you are pro-life or pro-choice is not even relevant here. If you sympathise even a little bit with the feminist cause, vote this motion down. Yes, Little 1 establishes areas of common ground that we can all support, but RB, please reject Little 2 through to Little 6.
Thank you. I now call Ms. Elizabeth Whittaker from the Medical Students' Conference, who is speaking for the motion and is a first-time speaker.
Hello, conference. I suppose that I could declare a conflict of interest as being a woman, and I very strongly resent potential criminalisation for choices taken against my own body by myself. So under what we've seen this morning, what I've heard, under current law, the default position is that all abortions are criminal, except for when performed in predetermined circumstances. So our default position is that abortion is criminal. This is obviously a negative and judgmental position. For a vast majority of women who have abortions, it is not a light decision. It's traumatic, it's upsetting, and it's harrowing. They grieve, they hurt, and they mourn, and they remember this for the rest of their lives. So why should we have a default position that is judgmental and negative? Why must we make a traumatic and difficult time even worse? We should be supportive to our patients in all circumstances. Like criminalising suicide, this is archaic. Criminalising abortions does not reduce the number of abortions, it just reduces the number of safe abortions. Decriminalising it will actually increase access to medical professional help. We should be preventing pregnancy, not criminalising it. This is a medical matter, not a criminal one, and our own personal views and choices and decisions do not have a place in treating our patients. Thank you.
I have lots of speakers. I think we have a few more who are first-time speakers as well. Ms. Grace Petkovic from Medical Students Committee, who is speaking against the motion and is also a first-time speaker.
Chair, RB. This motion would remove the possibility of courts imposing criminal penalties for illegal abortions. This is unnecessary and unhelpful. This campaign is based in part on the false premise that women seeking ordinary abortions are living under the fear of arrest and prosecution. This is simply not the case. 1 in 3 women in the UK has had an abortion. Clearly, 1 in 3 women have not been prosecuted. In fact, in the past 2 years, there have been just 2 convictions. Both involved rare and distressing scenarios. The first involved a man who had attacked a pregnant woman and caused her to miscarry. The second involved a woman who caused her own abortion at 32 weeks. Furthermore, the lobbyists behind this motion say that we should trust women. Well, according to polling carried out by Comres just last month, only 1% of women support the abortion limit being raised above the current limit of 24 weeks, as this motion proposes. 70% of women want the upper limit lowered to at least 20 weeks. In fact, 65% of women feel that criminal law plays an essential role in protecting patients against medical malpractice. 77% feel that doctors should be required by new legislation to verify in person that a patient seeking an abortion is not under pressure from a third party to undergo the abortion. If we trust women, then let's actually listen to them. Women want more support and more protection. Furthermore, within 6 days, over 1,500 doctors and medical students have signed a letter requesting that the BMA reject this motion. We must not appear as an extreme lobbying group, but rather the collected, national, representative body that we are. RB, this proposal isn't needed and isn't wanted, so please reject littles 2 to 6 of this motion.
Thank you. I call Dr. Eleanor Drager from the ARM Agenda Committee, who's speaking for the motion.
Thank you, Chair. RB. I'm a sexual health and HIV doctor, and I worked in an integrated clinic which had an early medical abortion service. I knew that when I took on the post. I was happy to be there. There were some doctors who were not happy that we started an early medical abortion service, and they exercised their allowed right to be conscientiously object. I had no issue with that. That was their right to do that. I'm not asking that you're not allowed to conscientiously object. What I am upset about is that because of the way the law says that 2 people have to consent to a woman having an abortion, our service folded after a year because we didn't have enough doctors who were willing to sign the form. That means that the women in my borough, which is one of the most deprived boroughs in the country, have less access to termination. There are women that I saw who were pregnant because of domestic abuse, with partners who would not let them use long-acting contraception, who would not use a condom, women who did not have the choice whether to have sex or not, and therefore didn't have the choice of whether to get pregnant or not. Because 2 doctors had to sign the form because of the 1967 Act, some of those women will now have to have a baby into a circumstance where having a baby is not the right choice for that woman. I cannot understand why you're allowed to consent for neurosurgery with the help of only 1 doctor, yet you have to have 2 to have a termination. I too have never seen a woman request a termination lightly. It is not a decision that any woman would make just because they want one. And for those people who say that decriminalisation would mean that that people are more likely to procure drugs on the internet, that is not the case. People are buying drugs off the internet because they do not have access to safe termination services. And they're also doing that because they do not have access to good sex education and they do not have access to contraception. If you are someone who calls yourself pro-life, you should be out there campaigning for good contraception for women and for better sexual health and contraception services than we have now.
Last sentence, Els.
Most of the women that I saw either didn't have good sex education or didn't fully understand what had happened. The young women, I mean, they didn't fully understand what would happen if they had sex without contraception. That is not their fault. That is the fault of our society. And so I would ask all of you to support this motion and support women's rights, because that's what this motion is about, the rights of women. Thank you.
Thank you. I now call Dr. Melody Redman from Yorkshire Regional Council, who's speaking against the motion.
Thank you. Chair, RB. First of all, I would like to take a poll. Please raise your hand if you've read the briefing documents in full. OK. If you have, you may also be concerned about Little 4 and Little 5, decriminalisation until viability. I am currently working in neonates, where we care for babies who are far below the statutory definition of viability, which is deemed to be 28 weeks under the Life Preservation Act, Infant Life Preservation Act. Big data from a decade ago, the famous Epicure study, showed that 62% of 25-weekers survive, 43% of whom without disability. RB, if we accept Little 4 and Little 5, however it may be argued to be intended, it would mean that one of these promising 25-weekers could be aborted with no criminal sanction. This motion asks for decriminalisation to be allowed until a minimum of 28 weeks, or even worse, up to term. Also consider the little 25-weeker who made it out and is in an incubator. We pull out all of the stops for them, and if the parents asked us to withdraw care, we would not do so unless it were in the baby's best interests. Should it really make any difference if one of these 25-weekers is in the womb rather than in an incubator? Fundamentally, this motion is about removing the legal safeguards which are currently in place to balance the rights of women with those of the developing fetus. Law has an important role in safeguarding and protecting the vulnerable. Whilst women who undergo abortion should not be subject to stigma, it is vital that there is some sort of criminal sanction in place to act as a deterrent for those uncommon but extreme acts. RB, we are letting down our society if we say that there is no sanction if someone induces their own abortion at 37 weeks. We are relinquishing our role as advocates of the vulnerable if we say that a 25-week baby who would otherwise stand a good chance of survival may be aborted without any criminal sanction. I urge you to reject this motion.
Thank you. I have a point of information first, which has been requested, and then I'll take your question.
The Comres poll has been mentioned several times. I Googled, and it had 2,008 people in it, 904 of whom were men. More than 1,000 of these people were over 50, 25 to 34-year-olds, 290 of them, and no under 25s. Thank you.
Thank you. Peter, you have a question?
My question is that Melody spoke quite a bit about the current limit being 28 weeks. I thought it was 24 weeks, and I'd like confirmation of which is correct.
John, would you like to respond to that?
Yes, there are 4 grounds in the Abortion Act, and 3 of them allow terminations of pregnancy up to term. The one that does not, the limit is 24 weeks, and that is in relation to women where the risk to the woman or her children of continuing the pregnancy is perceived to be greater than the risk of terminating the pregnancy.
Thank you, John. RB, we have had 10 speakers so far. I have a further 13 on the list. I'm quite happy to carry on if you wish. It is your will. If you wish to move to a vote, then please show me your cards. I need 2/3. Thank you. And those who wish to hear more debate, that did have the required 2/3. John, Chair of Committee.
I think we've had an excellent session chaired by Samira Ahmed and an excellent debate on this motion. There are deeply held beliefs in this room, and you have heard them on display in this debate, that are incompatible, and certainly it would be improper of me to give a personal view. It is the job of the Medical Ethics Committee to take forward your policy, and so it's very important that you are the people who decide on this issue. I think it's important that whatever we decide, we are respectful of and tolerant of the diversity of views that have been expressed. I do not believe that this motion is ill thought through, and I do not believe that those who have opposed the motion have given views that are ill thought through. And I certainly don't believe that this motion has been brought before you by people who are extremists. This has been brought before you by people who are thoughtful about the issues, but these are issues on which it is perfectly reasonable to have incompatible views, views where we disagree. One thing, however, that I think has come forward very strongly, both in the open debate and in this the debate on the motion, is compassion for women. And I think that is something that unites us all, that we feel compassionate, want to support women, and recognise that many of them are vulnerable, and many of them are taking decisions that are extremely painful and difficult. One of the issues that's been raised in the debate is stigmatisation, and I think that we want to minimise and push back against stigmatisation, either of women or of healthcare professionals. Certainly, as I said when I introduced the open debate, decriminalisation does not mean the absence of regulation. We are regulated throughout our medical practice. We are subject to good medical practice and the rulings of the GMC. And were you to vote for decriminalisation, you would not be saying that this should be an unregulated free-for-all. Regulation would continue as it does for all medical procedures. One of the issues that's been raised in the debate is the matter of autonomy, of freedom to choose, of women's rights, and you have heard those arguments. I would strongly emphasise that this is not an issue about time limits. They are not part of the motion that we are debating, and the BMA supports the present time limits that are there in the law. The BMA also strongly supports the right of doctors conscientiously to object to participation in abortion, and whatever you decide on this motion, we will defend the rights of doctors and other healthcare professionals who have conscientious objection to abortion. Another issue that's been raised in the debate is the issue of two doctors needing to agree to a termination. As I reminded you at the start of the open debate, in 2007, we agreed policy that abortion in the first trimester of pregnancy should be made available on the same basis of informed consent as other treatments, removing both the need for women to meet specified medical criteria and the need for two doctors to approve an abortion under the Abortion Act. So that is already your policy in relation to the first trimester. Finally, I think another thing that ought to unite us is to campaign for improved access for women to contraceptive services and sexual health services, which have been drastically cut back by the move of public health into local authorities in England and away from the NHS as a consequence of the Health and Social Care Act 2012. And I think we must unite in campaigning for better access to sexual health services and contraceptive services. You heard a vivid example of the consequences provided by El Strager in the debate earlier. So in conclusion, I've tried to draw out some of the strands in the debate. I do not wish to steer you as to which way you should decide, because this is very much a decision for you as members of the representative body.
Thank you, John. Chair of Council.
Thank you, Chair. Last year, you, the representative body, asked for this work to be done. And we should, I think, receive this work with thanks, the report that's been given to us and indeed the arrangements made for the facilitated debate just now and the before this motion debate and indeed this motion debate. There are, I think, two broad areas of contention here, and in the debates we've actually had, we've examined those areas, we've looked at the potential overlap between them. But one thing I would say is that I think part one of this motion deserves our support, and I would ask you to support it, because in the work the Ethics Committee has done, they have pulled together principles that really, I think, could and should unite us all, and which I haven't heard anybody really speak against in the debates that we've had. They're things that actually that take us forward from where we are and make sure that what we say and what we decide here today is not subject to the sort of misinterpretation that I know a number of people will try to place on it, whichever way you decide to go. So the two areas I mentioned, I think there's firstly the wishes and the choices made by women in our society. Some representatives here believe that those wishes and choices should be respected and within an ethical framework supported, but others believe that these wishes and choices themselves must be regulated, and of course at the moment, and there's been argument for that, continuing to be regulated by the criminal law. There's no overriding principle here, and each of those beliefs is valid and sits before you laid out in the parts of the motion. The second area, I think, is that of the position of doctors, those we are and those whom we represent in these procedures where we have a part in them. Again, the valid choices before us are whether that position should be subject to professional regulation or, further, by the criminal law as well. Either of these positions is valid, and they sit before you in the votes you're about to have. So it is the representative body's decision here. All sorts of arguments have been made, none are mandatory guides for you, and your choices will, I think, be informed by your view of our society and the place of and respect for women within it.
Thank you. Coral, do you want to respond to any points made? I know you indicated you would like parts 4 and 5 as a reference already, but there was a question about whether the whole motion should be a reference. So could you address that, please?
Firstly, I just want to start with a point of information from something that was raised. Having brought out Dr. Google, I found that sex ratios in Canada have actually fallen. There are now more women born in 2015 than there are men, and the law was changed in 1988. That's just for information. I'd like to thank everyone for their contributions. It's been a really worthwhile debate. I do not want the whole thing taken as a reference, just those two things. To portray decriminalisation as leading to abortion on demand without regulation questions the integrity of the medical profession and does not display trust in doctors to make ethical and clinically led regulations. We must respect women and have trust in women to make responsible decisions for themselves and their families. Our personal positions must not influence our treatment of our patients. We must be honest about the 1861 Act. It is not a deterrent. It does not lead to a decrease in abortion or protects women in vulnerable situations. The 1861 Act leads to unsafe abortion, deaths of women, and fear of prosecution for women and doctors. The call for decriminalisation is not driven by abortion providers. Motion 50 has been drawn up by doctors who do not believe that women or doctors should go to prison for providing or having an abortion. If you agree with this, please support this motion.
Thank you, Coral. RB, we will be using button votes for these and obviously doing it in its individual parts. When we're looking at part 1, just for clarity, the asterisk at the end is referring to the footnotes that you see printed underneath the motion, which are the principles set out in the discussion paper. So, thank you, Audrey. We are moving to vote on motion 50, part 1. Those voting for the motion, press 1. Against the motion, press 2. And I will use cards for abstentions. I've just said use cards for abstentions. So, you want it buttons for the abstentions? Audrey, is it possible to do a third option of abstentions on the button vote? No, apparently it is not technically possible to add it in at this moment. So we're moving to a vote on motion 50, part 1. Those for the motion press 1, against the motion press 2, and then I'll have to use cards for abstentions. Just wait for the timer. Vote now. And cards for abstentions for part 1. I just see a couple. Thank you. We move to voting on part 2. As a straight vote for part 2, vote 1 for, 2 against, and I'll have to use cards for abstentions. Vote now. And that is passed, but can I also have some cards for abstentions? And a handful of abstentions. Thank you. We move to vote on motion 50, part 3. Vote 1 for, 2 against. And vote now. That is also passed. Do you want to show me cards for any abstentions? Again, we've got a handful of them. Moving to vote on part 4 as a reference. Those for, press 1, against, press 2, and I'll use cards for abstentions. Vote now. That is also carried, and I'll use cards for abstentions. Again, slightly more of a handful, but still a handful. Moving on to part 5 as a reference. Vote 1 for, 2 against, and I'll use cards for abstentions. Vote now. That is also carried, and can I see cards for abstentions? Again, a handful. And we move on to part 6 as a substantive item. For, vote 1, against, vote 2, and I'll use cards for abstentions. And vote now. And that is also carried. And can I see cards for abstentions? Again, a handful. Thank you, RB, for your thoughtful debate.